Then why does my security brief have her photo? The president's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room fell silent anyway. Crystal glasses stopped moving. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Every donor, aide, military officer, and political guest in the White House reception hall turned toward me, toward the woman my father had just laughed at. I remember looking across the room at Senator Richard Whitmore, my father, a decorated Vietnam veteran, a man who had spent nearly 40 years in public office, a man who had never once looked proud when he looked at me, and for the first time in my life I watched the color drain from his face. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd been reading the wrong map for decades. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand that moment, you need to understand how I ended up standing inside the White House wearing a Navy uniform while my own father treated me like a disappointment. My name is Sarah Whitmore. At the time of this story, I was 48 years old and a commander in the United States Navy. I'd spent more than 20 years serving my country. Most people didn't know exactly what I did. That wasn't unusual. In my line of work, quiet was often part of the job description. The morning of the White House event began like any other duty day. I woke up before sunrise in my small townhouse outside Arlington, Virginia. The house was modest. No mansion. No luxury cars. No expensive artwork. Just a comfortable place filled with books, framed Navy photographs, and memories. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window watching the early morning light settle over the neighborhood. For a few minutes I allowed myself to enjoy the silence. Then I noticed the invitation sitting on the counter. The White House seal seemed almost unreal, even after all those years in uniform. I picked it up and read it again, not because I needed to, because I still couldn't quite believe it. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks earlier. Official, personal, and impossible to ignore. The president was hosting a national security recognition event, a small gathering. Military leaders, senior government officials, several veterans, a handful of people whose contributions were not usually discussed in public. I was one of them. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt nervous. Not because of the president, not because of the White House, because of my father. I knew he'd be there. Senator Whitmore never missed an opportunity to attend an event that involved cameras, influence, or prestige. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 4 months. That wasn't unusual either. Our relationship had been strained for years, maybe decades. The truth is, I spent most of my childhood trying to earn his approval, and failing. My younger brother Daniel always seemed to know how. Daniel was charming, outgoing, the kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly make friends. Dad loved that. When Daniel became an attorney, Dad threw a party. When Daniel made partner, Dad invited half the state legislature. When Daniel bought his first house, Dad couldn't stop talking about it. I joined the Navy. Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. I still remember that day. I was 22 years old, fresh out of college, excited, nervous, proud. I told him I'd accepted my commission. I expected questions, maybe congratulations. Instead, he folded the newspaper and said something I've never forgotten. "Politics changes the world, Sarah." Then he shrugged. "Military people just follow orders." That sentence stayed with me for years, not because it made me angry, because it hurt. Over time, I learned something important. You can survive criticism from strangers, but criticism from family settles deeper, especially when it comes from the person whose approval you've wanted your entire life. The one person who never seemed capable of giving it. Fortunately, my mother balanced things out. My mother, Eleanor Whitmore, had a gift for understanding people. She saw strengths others missed. She saw them in me long before I saw them myself. Whenever Dad dismissed one of my accomplishments, Mom would quietly remind me why I served. "Your worth isn't determined by applause," she'd smile. "Serve with integrity and let the results speak for themselves." Simple advice, but it carried me through some difficult years, especially after she died. Mom passed away from cancer 9 years before the White House event. Her death changed everything. After that, whatever bridge existed between Dad and me grew even weaker. There was nobody left to stand in the middle. Nobody left to translate. Nobody left to remind him that I was more than the daughter who disappointed him. By 8 o'clock that morning, I was dressed in full Navy service uniform. I checked every detail twice. Shoes polished, ribbons aligned, hair regulation neat. The same habits I'd followed for decades. Outside Washington was already busy. Traffic crawled. Tourists filled the sidewalks. The city felt alive. As my car approached the White House complex, I found myself thinking about my mother. I wished she could have seen this day. Not because of the prestige, because she would have enjoyed the irony. The daughter nobody paid attention to was being invited to one of the most important buildings in the country. Security processing took time. Several checkpoints. Several credential verifications. Nothing unusual. Eventually, I entered the reception area. The room was elegant without being flashy. Military officers mingled with diplomats. Veterans shared stories. Staff members moved quietly through the crowd. Then I heard my father's voice. I hadn't even seen him yet. I recognized the laugh first. Confident. Political. Practiced. The kind of laugh designed to make everyone nearby feel included. I turned. There he was, standing with several donors and congressional colleagues. His silver hair perfectly groomed. His smile bright. His posture commanding. One of the donors noticed me approaching. He asked Dad a simple question. "Is that your daughter?" Dad looked over. Our eyes met. For one brief moment I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe he'd smile. Maybe he'd say something kind. Instead he laughed. "That's my daughter." The group smiled politely. Then he added, "She's just a Navy secretary." Several people chuckled. Not maliciously. Just following his lead. The same way people always did around powerful men. I stood there for a moment. The old hurt returned instantly. Not because of the joke itself. Because I was 12 years old again. Trying to be good enough. Trying to matter. Trying to earn something that never seemed available. But years in the Navy had taught me self-control. So I smiled politely, nodded, and walked past them. I didn't know it then. But within the next hour, the President of the United States was going to say a single sentence that would change everything my father believed about me, and perhaps everything I believed about him. I spent the next 20 minutes doing exactly what I had trained myself to do for most of my adult life. I ignored the sting. Not the words themselves. I was long past being wounded by a joke about my job title. What hurt was knowing my father still saw me through the same lens he had used for decades. No matter what I accomplished. No matter what responsibilities I carried. No matter how many years I served. To him, I remained the daughter who somehow failed to become the person he expected. I accepted a cup of coffee from a White House staff member and moved toward a quieter corner of the reception hall. Several military officers were gathered nearby. Most were people I knew only professionally. We exchanged polite greetings. Nothing unusual. That was one thing I had always appreciated about military culture. People cared less about who your parents were and more about whether you did your job. Rank mattered. Performance mattered. Reliability mattered. Family name rarely entered the conversation. Across the room I could still see my father entertaining his circle of donors and political allies. He looked completely at ease. As always, Richard Whitmore had spent most of his life in rooms exactly like this. Fundraisers, receptions, campaign dinners, television interviews. Public recognition was his natural habitat. I sometimes wondered if he even realized how much he needed it. The answer came to me years earlier during one of our rare arguments. I had just returned from a lengthy overseas assignment. The details weren't something I could discuss. The mission had taken nearly 8 months, 8 months away from home, 8 months of 14-hour days, 8 months of pressure. When I finally returned, I attended a family gathering at my brother Daniel's house. Dad spent the entire evening talking about a committee hearing he'd chaired in Washington. At one point, a family friend asked what I had been doing. Before I could answer, Dad spoke. "Oh, Sarah's work is all classified." He laughed. "Which usually means paperwork." Everyone chuckled. I laughed too. What else was I supposed to do? But later that night, after everyone had left, I confronted him. For perhaps the first time in my life. "Dad, why do you always do that?" He looked genuinely confused. "Do what? Minimize everything I do." His expression hardened. "I don't minimize anything." "Really?" I asked. "Because it feels like you've spent 30 years acting like my service doesn't matter." His answer arrived instantly. The answer of a man who had rehearsed the belief for years. "You chose a career nobody understands." That was the end of the conversation, at least on the surface. But I carried those words with me. You chose a career nobody understands. Maybe he was right. The irony was that the less people understood my work, the more important it often became. I was thinking about that conversation when I noticed movement near the entrance. Several Secret Service agents shifted positions. Nothing dramatic, just subtle adjustments. People nearby straightened their posture. Conversations softened. The president had entered the room. I had met senior officials before. Cabinet members, admirals, generals, agency directors. But the president carried a different kind of presence. Not because he demanded attention. Because everyone instinctively gave it. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging greetings. I expected him to remain focused on the major political figures in attendance: governors, senators, cabinet officials, people whose names regularly appeared on television. Then something unexpected happened. The White House chief of staff leaned toward him and quietly said something. The president immediately looked across the room, directly at me. For a second, I thought he might be looking at someone standing behind me. Then he started walking in my direction. The conversations around me grew quieter. A few heads turned. Several guests stepped aside. I suddenly became aware of every ribbon on my uniform, every crease, every detail. The president stopped in front of me and smiled. "Commander Whitmore." I stood a little straighter. "Mr. President, it's good to finally meet you in person." That sentence alone caused several nearby conversations to stop. I could feel eyes turning toward us. The president extended his hand. I shook it. "Thank you for being here." "Thank you for inviting me, sir." His smile widened. "We've been looking forward to this." "We," not I. "We." That single word carried weight, the kind of weight my father immediately noticed. Across the room I saw him watching. The politician's smile remained on his face, but I knew him well enough to see the confusion forming underneath. The president and I exchanged a few brief comments. Nothing classified, nothing dramatic, just professional courtesy. Then my father approached. He arrived with the confidence of a man accustomed to inserting himself into important conversations. "Mr. President." The president greeted him warmly. "Senator Whitmore." Dad placed a hand lightly against my shoulder, a gesture that looked affectionate to observers. I knew better. Then came the comment. The same kind of comment he had made my entire life. The same kind of comment that always earned easy laughter. He smiled. "Well, you've met my daughter." A few people nearby smiled politely. Then he added, "She's just a Navy secretary." A couple of donors laughed. The president didn't. In fact, he looked genuinely puzzled. His eyebrows pulled together slightly. For a moment, he simply stared at my father. Then he asked a question. A simple question. A calm question. A devastating question. "She's a secretary." Dad chuckled. "More or less." The president tilted his head. "Then why does my security brief have her photo?" Silence. Complete silence. The effect was immediate. Every conversation within earshot died. Several donors stared at me. Others stared at my father. One retired general nearly dropped his drink. The president wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He sounded honestly confused, as though the facts simply didn't match. Because they didn't. My father stood frozen. The practiced smile disappeared. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. The president continued, "I've seen Commander Whitmore's name for years." Years, not months, years. The room remained perfectly still. I wished I could disappear. Not because I was embarrassed. Because I knew exactly what my father was feeling. For decades, he had assumed there wasn't much to know about my career. Now he was discovering he might have been wrong. Very wrong. The president looked at me, then back at my father. Then he said something that would only deepen the mystery. "Your daughter helped prevent a very serious problem for this country." The room seemed to inhale collectively. No further explanation followed. None was needed, and none could be given. The details weren't public. They never would be. My father stared at me, not with anger, not with pride, not yet. What I saw was something unfamiliar. A man realizing there was an entire chapter of his daughter's life he had never bothered to read. And for the first time in decades, he looked like he wanted to know what was inside it. For the rest of that evening, people looked at me differently. Not dramatically, not in the exaggerated way television shows often portray, but differently. The subtle shift was impossible to miss. The donors who had laughed at my father's joke suddenly seemed eager to introduce themselves. The congressional aides who had barely noticed me earlier now wanted to shake my hand. Several military officers approached and offered quiet congratulations. Nobody knew exactly what the president meant. That was the problem, and the attraction. People are naturally curious about things they aren't allowed to know, especially in Washington, especially when the president himself hints at something significant. My father remained unusually quiet. That alone felt strange. Richard Whitmore always had something to say, always had an opinion, always controlled the conversation. But after the president's comment, he seemed distracted, as if he were mentally reviewing 40 years of assumptions and discovering cracks in all of them. I understood the feeling. Years earlier, I had experienced something similar myself. Only the person I misunderstood had been my father. When I was younger, I assumed he simply didn't care about me. It took age and experience to realize the truth was more complicated. My father cared. He just didn't know how to show it. Unfortunately, poor communication can damage relationships as effectively as indifference. And over time, the result often looks exactly the same. A retired Marine Corps general approached me while I was standing near one of the reception hall windows. He smiled warmly. "Commander Whitmore." "General." "I've been hoping we'd finally meet." That wasn't the first time I'd heard that phrase. It always made me uncomfortable. The nature of my work meant many people knew my name while very few knew me personally. The general extended his hand. "You saved a lot of people from having a very bad year." I smiled politely. "I was part of a team." He laughed. "That's exactly what everyone says." Before I could respond, another retired officer joined us. Then another. Soon I found myself standing in a small circle of military veterans discussing service deployments, leadership, and retirement. Topics that felt normal, comfortable, grounded. Across the room I noticed my father watching. He wasn't interrupting. He wasn't boasting. He was observing, trying to understand, trying to solve a puzzle. Eventually he walked over. The conversation shifted slightly as he approached. Everyone knew who he was. Several officers greeted him respectfully. One of them, a retired admiral, shook his hand. "Senator?" "Admiral." The admiral smiled. "You must be proud." My father hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. "Proud of what?" The admiral looked surprised. Then he glanced toward me. "Your daughter." An awkward silence followed. The admiral clearly assumed my father understood my career. My father clearly did not. The admiral recovered quickly. "She's done remarkable work." Dad forced a smile. "So I've been hearing." The admiral nodded. "Not many people have contributed at that level." Then he excused himself. My father stood beside me for several seconds. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked a question. A simple question. One that revealed how little he actually knew. "What exactly do you do?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I had imagined that conversation for years. For decades, really. The problem was that there wasn't a simple answer. And even if there had been, this wasn't the place. "I work in intelligence." He frowned. "I know that much." I nodded. "Then you know as much as I can tell you." The old irritation flashed briefly across his face. The same irritation he displayed whenever he couldn't control a conversation. But this time it faded quickly. For perhaps the first time in his life, he seemed willing to accept not knowing. That realization surprised me. As the evening continued, memories began resurfacing. Memories I usually kept buried. Most people assume military sacrifice means combat, danger, physical hardship, and certainly those things exist. But there are other sacrifices too. The quiet ones, the invisible ones, the ones nobody thanks you for because nobody knows they happened. I thought about birthdays missed, family gatherings skipped, relationships that slowly disappeared because I was always somewhere else, friends who eventually stopped inviting me because they assumed I'd be unavailable. I remembered spending Thanksgiving in secure facilities, Christmas mornings overseas, anniversaries forgotten because work consumed everything. There were years when my entire life existed inside briefing rooms, secure communication centers, and classified projects. Years when I couldn't explain where I was going. Years when I couldn't explain why I was leaving. Years when people assumed I simply didn't care enough to stay connected. The truth was often the opposite. Duty required distance, and distance comes with a price. My father never saw that price. How could he? I never talked about it. And even if I had, much of it couldn't be discussed. That was the paradox of my career. The more important the work became, the less I could say about it. The less I could say, the less impressive it appeared. People naturally fill empty spaces with assumptions. My father had spent decades doing exactly that. Near the end of the reception, the White House Chief of Staff stepped onto a small platform. The room gradually quieted. Guests turned toward him. The Chief of Staff thanked everyone for attending. He recognized several veterans, several military leaders. Then he mentioned a handful of individuals whose contributions could not be fully described publicly. I immediately knew where this was going, and I wanted no part of it. The Chief of Staff looked directly at me. "Commander Sarah Whitmore." I felt every eye in the room shift. The Chief of Staff smiled. "There are certain Americans whose work remains largely invisible." The room stayed silent. "Sometimes that's because the work itself must remain invisible." A few heads nodded. He continued. "Tonight we want to acknowledge one of those individuals." I wished the floor would open beneath me. The chief of staff didn't reveal classified information. He didn't mention operations. He didn't discuss intelligence programs, but his message was clear. Because of her service, American lives were protected. The room erupted into applause. Then something happened that caught me completely off guard. People stood, one after another. Military officers, veterans, government officials, White House staff. A standing ovation. I stood frozen, embarrassed, grateful, overwhelmed. And then I looked toward my father. He wasn't clapping. Not because he disapproved. Not because he was angry. He looked stunned, as though someone had handed him evidence that contradicted everything he believed. His eyes never left me. And in that moment, for the first time in my entire life, I didn't see a senator. I didn't see a public figure. I didn't see the impossible man whose approval I had chased for decades. I saw an aging father realizing he might never have truly known his own daughter. And somehow that hurt more than all the criticism that came before. The standing ovation lasted less than a minute. But for my father, it might as well have lasted an hour. For me, it felt even longer. I stood there awkwardly wishing people would sit down and return to their conversations. Recognition had never been something I chased. In my world, success usually meant nobody knew your name. The less attention you received, the better you had probably done your job. Eventually, the applause faded. People resumed talking. The reception moved forward. But something fundamental had changed. My father and I both knew it. The question was what would happen next. For most of my life, difficult conversations between us simply never happened. We avoided them, ignored them, buried them beneath holidays, birthdays, and polite family dinners. Years of disappointment accumulated like layers of dust, visible if you looked closely enough, ignored if you didn't. That night, however, there was nowhere left to hide. The event concluded shortly before 9 o'clock. Guests slowly began leaving. I was preparing to head toward the exit when I heard my father's voice behind me. "Sarah." I stopped, turned. He stood alone. No donors, no aides, no reporters, no audience. Just a 72-year-old man looking strangely uncertain. "We need to talk." I almost laughed. Those 4 words were probably 20 years overdue. I nodded. "Okay." The White House grounds were beautiful at night. The air was cool. The city lights glowed beyond the fences. We found a quiet seating area away from the remaining guests. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. My father finally broke the silence. "I didn't know." I looked at him. "Didn't know what?" He exhaled slowly. "Any of it." I waited. "I didn't know the president knew your name." He paused. "I didn't know those officers respected you that much." Another pause. "I didn't know..." His voice trailed off. I finished the sentence for him. "You didn't know me." The words landed harder than I intended. His eyes dropped toward the ground. For once he didn't argue. For once he didn't defend himself. For once he didn't have a prepared response. The silence stretched. Years seemed to sit inside it. Then something unexpected happened. The anger I had carried for so long finally surfaced. Not explosive anger. Not shouting. Not bitterness. Something sadder. More honest. I looked directly at him. "Do you know how many promotions I've had?" He frowned. I already knew the answer. "No." "Do you know where I was deployed after 9/11? "No." "Do you know how many times I was overseas?" He shook his head.
"No."
I nodded. "Do you know when I made commander?" Again silence. The answer was obvious. He didn't. My father looked older than I had ever seen him. Not physically. Emotionally. Like a man slowly discovering an entire section of his life had gone missing. I continued. "Not because I wanted revenge, because I needed him to hear it. Every time something happened in my career, I waited for you to ask." His eyes met mine. "You never did." The words came easier now. Years of restraint finally giving way. "When I got promoted to lieutenant commander, you missed the ceremony." His shoulders tightened. "When I received a commendation after one of my deployments, you sent a text message." I swallowed. "When Mom died, I thought maybe things would change." That one hurt. Even now. Even after all those years, I thought maybe we'd become closer. My voice softened. "But after she was gone, we barely talked." He stared at the ground. The senator. The public speaker. The man who could debate anyone. Now completely silent. Finally he spoke. "I thought you didn't need me." I blinked. "What?" His voice cracked slightly. "I thought you had everything figured out. The confession surprised me. You were always independent." He shook his head. "Your brother asked for advice." A weak smile. "Constantly." I almost laughed. That part was true. Daniel called Dad about everything: jobs, investments, politics, home repairs, parenting, everything. Meanwhile, I had learned long ago not to expect much guidance. Dad continued, "You never asked." I stared at him. Then I said something I had never said before. "I stopped asking because you never listened." The words hung between us. Painful. True. Necessary. For several moments, neither of us moved. Then I reached into my purse. There was something I had carried for years. Something I had never expected to use. A sealed envelope. The paper had aged slightly. The edges worn from time. My father recognized it immediately. His eyes widened. "Is that—" I nodded. "Mom left it for you." His expression changed instantly. "She left me a letter. 9 years ago." He looked stunned. "Why didn't you give it to me?" I remembered my mother's exact instructions, every word, because I had replayed them hundreds of times. "She told me not to." His eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. "She said I should wait until I believed you were ready." The words seemed to hit him harder than anything else that evening. Slowly, I handed him the envelope. His fingers trembled as he opened it. For several minutes, he read silently. The night around us faded. The city noise disappeared. The world narrowed to a single sheet of paper. I watched emotions move across his face. Confusion. Recognition. Regret. Heartbreak. Finally, tears appeared. Actual tears. I had not seen my father cry since my mother's funeral. He lowered the letter, looked away, then read one section again. His voice barely worked. "What did she mean?" I already knew. I had read the letter years ago with Mom's permission before she passed. There was one line that explained everything. One line that struck like a hammer. My father read it aloud. "Richard," his voice cracked, "you spent your life trying to build a legacy." He stopped. "Tried again. Meanwhile, your daughter became one." Silence. Absolute silence. For a long time, he stared at those words. The words of the woman who had known both of us better than anyone else ever would. And for the first time in my life, I watched my father stop defending himself. Stop explaining. Stop justifying. Instead, he simply cried. Not as a senator. Not as a veteran. Not as a public figure. Just as a father realizing how much of his daughter's life he had missed. And sitting there beneath the lights of Washington, I realized something unexpected. My father wasn't the only one carrying pain all those years. He had been carrying regret too. Neither of us had known how to bridge the distance. Now the question was whether it was finally too late. For several days after the White House event, I didn't hear from my father. That wasn't unusual. In fact, if someone had told me a month earlier that we would spend an evening discussing our relationship and reading a letter from my late mother, I probably would have laughed. The conversation had exhausted both of us. Not because it ended badly, because it had been honest. And honesty can be surprisingly tiring after decades of avoidance. I returned to work. The same secure offices. The same classified briefings. The same responsibilities. The world hadn't changed. At least not on the surface. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. A week after the White House event, I received a call from my brother Daniel. That alone caught my attention. Daniel and I were close enough, but we usually communicated through text messages and occasional family dinners. He rarely called during work hours. "Hey, Sarah." His tone sounded amused. "What's going on?" "You've become famous." I groaned immediately. "Please tell me that's a joke." "Nope." He laughed. "Absolutely not." Apparently, several photographs from the White House reception had appeared in newspapers and political publications. Nothing dramatic, just coverage of the event. The president, military leaders, veterans, government officials, and one particular photograph that seemed to attract unusual attention. The president speaking with me? The image itself wasn't remarkable. The questions surrounding it were, why had the president recognized a relatively unknown Navy commander? Why had the White House chief of staff publicly praised her? Why had several retired generals given her a standing ovation? Washington loves mysteries, especially when nobody can explain them. The speculation started immediately. Most of it was harmless. Some of it was ridiculous. Fortunately, none of it revealed anything important. The people who actually knew the details weren't talking. And neither was I. "What about Dad?" I asked. Daniel became quiet. "He's having a rough week." I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me felt sympathy. Another part remembered 40 years of disappointment. Daniel continued, "He's been asking questions." That surprised me. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about you." I almost laughed. After decades of indifference, my father had apparently become curious. The timing was hard to ignore. Over the next month, I gradually learned what had happened. My father had started contacting people. Not reporters. Not political allies. Veterans. Military officers. Former colleagues. People who had crossed paths with me during my career. At first, I found the idea mildly irritating. Where had this interest been 20 years ago? Where had these questions been when I was a young officer trying to prove myself? Where had they been when Mom was still alive? But over time, my frustration softened, because the answers he received were changing him. One afternoon, I received a phone call from a retired Navy captain I deeply respected. We had served together years earlier. After a brief conversation, he chuckled. "Your father called me." I closed my eyes. "Oh no." The captain laughed. "Relax, it wasn't bad." "What did he want?" The answer was simple. He wanted to know what kind of officer you were. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. 48 years old, 26 years in uniform, and my father was finally conducting basic research. The captain continued. I told him the truth. I hesitated. "And what was that?" His voice softened. I told him you were the person everyone wanted on difficult assignments. The words caught me off guard. Not because they were flattering, because they came from someone whose opinion mattered. The captain continued. I also told him something else. "What?" "That leadership isn't about visibility." I knew exactly where he was going. The lesson my father had spent his life missing. The best leaders often work quietly. That conversation stayed with me. A few weeks later, Daniel invited me to lunch. We met at a small restaurant near Alexandria. Nothing fancy, just good food and familiar company. Halfway through the meal, he leaned forward. "I need to tell you something." I immediately became suspicious. "That usually means trouble." He smiled. "Not this time." Then he said something I never expected to hear. "Dad's embarrassed." I raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Daniel laughed. "Everything." The answer surprised me. Not because Dad felt embarrassed. Because he admitted it. According to Daniel, my father had begun reviewing old family photographs. Old letters. Old military announcements. Newspaper clippings. Promotion notices. Documents he had ignored for years. Suddenly he was seeing them differently. Through a different lens. A father's lens instead of a politician's. One evening he reportedly told Daniel something that stayed with me. I spent 40 years measuring achievement by attention. Daniel paused, then added, "And now I think I was wrong." I didn't know what to say. The statement felt so unlike my father that it was almost difficult to believe. Yet it made sense. Politics rewards visibility. Military service often rewards discretion. My father had spent his entire life in one world. I had spent mine in the other. Neither of us truly understood the other's environment. The difference was that only one of us had been judging. As the months passed, something else became clear. The revenge everyone expected never happened. There were people who assumed I would publicly criticize my father. People who expected interviews, articles, family drama, public confrontation. They didn't understand me. Or perhaps they didn't understand what revenge actually means. The truth is that I never planned revenge. Not once. I never dreamed about humiliating my father. Never imagined embarrassing him. Never wanted him to suffer. What happened at the White House wasn't revenge. It was reality finally catching up with assumptions. That distinction matters. Because revenge usually seeks destruction. Reality seeks understanding. The irony was impossible to ignore. The humiliation my father feared most arrived without any effort from me. I never exposed him. I never attacked him. I never told anyone how he treated me. His embarrassment came entirely from discovering the truth too late. And perhaps that was the most powerful lesson of all. Success became the revenge. Patience became the revenge. Integrity became the revenge. Not because they hurt him, because they forced him to see clearly. For the first time in his life, my father was looking at me without expectations, without comparisons, without disappointment, simply seeing me as I was. And as painful as the process had been, I was beginning to realize something. That might have been the greatest gift either of us could receive. 6 months after the White House reception, I found myself standing inside a Veterans Community Center in Richmond, Virginia. The building wasn't impressive. No marble floors, no television cameras, no Secret Service, no political donors, just veterans, families, volunteers, and people trying to help one another. In many ways, it was exactly the kind of place my mother would have loved. The event was a fundraiser for housing assistance programs that supported aging veterans. Many of the attendees were in their 70s and 80s. Some walked with canes. Some wore faded unit caps from Vietnam. Others proudly displayed patches from Korea, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The atmosphere felt genuine. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. People were simply showing up for each other. And that was precisely why my father had chosen it. At least that's what he told me later. A month earlier, he had called unexpectedly. Not a text message. Not a brief voicemail. An actual phone call. The kind fathers and daughters are supposed to have. The kind we rarely shared. "I'd like you to attend something with me." Those were his exact words. I remember sitting quietly on the other end of the line. "What kind of event?" "A veterans fundraiser." I waited. Then came something I never expected. It would mean a lot to me. Simple words. But they carried more sincerity than some of the speeches I'd heard him give over the years. So I agreed. Now here we were, standing together near the stage. The event organizer approached. "Senator Whitmore, we're ready." Dad nodded. Then he looked at me. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different now. Comfortable. Not strained. Not defensive. Simply comfortable. That alone felt like a miracle. The organizer handed him a microphone. The audience settled into their seats. Conversations quieted. My father stepped onto the stage. For decades, public speaking had been one of his greatest strengths. I had seen him command crowds with ease, seen him dominate debates, seen him inspire audiences, but tonight felt different. Tonight he looked nervous. The realization made me smile. The senator began by thanking the volunteers. Then he thanked the veterans. He spoke about service, sacrifice, responsibility. The themes were familiar. Then his tone changed. Softer, more personal. He looked toward me. The audience followed his gaze. I immediately knew what was happening, and I wasn't sure I liked it. "My daughter is here tonight." Several people turned in my direction. I resisted the urge to disappear beneath the nearest table. Dad continued. "For most of my life, I thought I understood success." The room grew quiet. "I thought success was visibility." A pause. "I thought success was recognition." Another pause. "I thought success meant being known." The audience listened carefully. Then he smiled. "The older I get, the more I realize I was wrong." I felt my throat tighten, because I knew exactly where this was heading. My father looked directly at me. And then he said something I will carry for the rest of my life. I spent years telling people who my daughter was. The room remained silent. "The truth is," his voice faltered, "I never took the time to find out." For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words simply hung in the air. Honest. Painful. Beautiful. Then the audience applauded. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just warmly. The kind of applause reserved for truth. I looked down, trying unsuccessfully to hide my emotions. My father finished his remarks shortly afterward. When he stepped off the stage, people greeted him warmly. But something had changed. For perhaps the first time in his public life, people weren't responding to his position. They were responding to his honesty. Later that evening, after the fundraiser ended, we walked outside together. The sun was setting. The parking lot was nearly empty. The Virginia sky glowed orange and gold. We stopped beside my car. Neither of us seemed eager to leave. Finally, Dad spoke. "I owe you an apology." I smiled gently. "You've already apologized." "Not enough." I waited. He looked out toward the horizon. "I missed a lot." The words carried genuine sorrow. "I can't get those years back?" "No." He nodded slowly. "No." For a few moments we simply stood there. Then he continued. "Your mother saw things I didn't." I smiled. She usually did. That earned a quiet laugh, the first truly relaxed laugh we had shared in years. Dad shook his head. "I spent so much time looking at what people achieved." His voice softened. "I forgot to pay attention to who they became." The statement hit me harder than he probably realized. Because that had always been the real issue. Not rank, not recognition, not career success. Being seen, being known, being valued. Every child wants that from a parent, no matter how old they become. The evening air felt cooler now. The sun had nearly disappeared. My father turned toward me. "I am proud of you." Simple words. 3 seconds. 4 words. 40 years late, and yet they still mattered. More than I wanted to admit. Tears filled my eyes. I didn't try to hide them. Neither did he. For once, neither of us needed armor. No titles, no uniforms, no political office, no accomplishments. Just a father and daughter finding their way back to each other. I thought about my mother. About the letter. About everything that had happened since the White House. The strange thing was that none of it had unfolded the way I once imagined. When we're younger, we often believe justice arrives dramatically. A perfect moment. A perfect victory. A perfect reckoning. Real life rarely works that way. The greatest victory wasn't watching my father turn pale in the White House. It wasn't the standing ovation. It wasn't the recognition. The greatest victory was healing something that both of us thought might be broken forever. That was the reward. That was the blessing. That was the miracle. And if there's one lesson I hope stays with you after hearing my story, it's this. The people we love don't always become who we expected. Sometimes they become something better. But we can only see that if we're willing to look before it's too late. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, a parent, a child, a veteran, or a loved one you've lost touch with, I hope you'll take a moment to reach out. A phone call, a conversation, an honest word. Sometimes healing begins with something that simple. And if this story spoke to your heart, consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder. Because the people we overlook today may be the very people we cherish tomorrow. Thank you for listening. The first thing my father said after I answered the phone was, "The bank's taking the house. What did you do?" His voice was sharp with panic, stripped of the cold authority he had used on me my whole life. In the background, I could hear my mother crying. Papers rustled. A television blared somewhere in the house. I remember smiling. Not because I was happy. Not because revenge had ever been something I dreamed about. But because for the first time in 42 years, Frank Reeves sounded afraid, and I wasn't the one standing there shaking. I quietly ended the call. Then I looked through the window of my motel room at the gray Virginia morning and let myself remember how all of it had started. It had begun exactly 1 week earlier. At 5:03 on a Monday morning, someone started pounding on my apartment door hard enough to rattle the brass unit number screwed into the frame. I woke instantly. 20 years in Army intelligence teaches you to wake fast. For a moment I thought I was back in Afghanistan, half asleep in a plywood bunk, while incoming alarms screamed through the dark. My heart slammed against my ribs before my mind caught up with where I was. Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Officer housing. Stateside. Safe. Then the pounding came again. Major Reeves Military Police, open the door. I was already out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. My apartment was neat, everything exactly where it belonged. Habit, discipline, order had shaped my life for more than 2 decades. I threw on a robe and opened the door. 2 MPs stood there in full uniform. Behind them was a man in civilian clothes holding a leather folder. The older MP avoided my eyes. That was my first warning. The civilian introduced himself as Special Agent Thomas Keating with Army Criminal Investigation Division. "Major Abigail Reeves," he said, his voice clipped and formal, "you are being placed under immediate administrative suspension, pending investigation into unauthorized access and transfer of classified financial intelligence records." For a moment, the words didn't register. Unauthorized access. Transfer. I stared at him. There has to be some mistake. I'm afraid not. He handed me papers. Legal language blurred across the page. My security clearance was suspended effective immediately. My command authority was revoked pending investigation. I was prohibited from entering secure facilities or accessing military systems. It felt unreal, like hearing details from someone else's life. I had spent 21 years building my career. West Point. 2 overseas tours. Bronze Star. Countless nights under fluorescent lights tracking financial trails through hostile networks. And now some stranger was standing in my doorway dismantling all of it before sunrise. "I want my JAG representative." "You'll have one by 800. The younger MP shifted uncomfortably. He knew me. I recognized him too, Private Morales, fresh-faced kid from Texas. I'd once helped him get emergency leave when his father had a stroke. Now he stood there while another man confiscated my government-issued laptop and credentials. That was how quickly dignity can vanish. By 6:30, the rumors had already started. Military communities are small. News moves faster than wildfire. By 7, I had 3 texts from officers asking if the allegations were true. By 8, silence. No one wants proximity to disgrace. I sat in my apartment until 10, staring at my blank television screen. Then I did the one thing I hadn't done in years. I drove to my parents' house. They lived in Columbia, Maryland, in the same neat colonial home where I'd grown up. White shutters, blue hydrangeas, American flag hanging proudly from the porch. Frank Reeves believed deeply in appearances. A polished lawn meant discipline. Pressed shirts meant respectability. Children who succeeded reflected well on their parents. Children who stumbled were an embarrassment to be corrected. I had spent most of my life trying to earn his approval. Even West Point hadn't fully done it. He'd shaken my hand at graduation and said, "Not bad." That was the closest thing to pride I'd ever received. I pulled into their driveway just after noon. For a second, sitting there with my hands gripping the wheel, I was 16 again, hoping home would feel safe. I rang the bell. My mother answered. Elaine Reeves looked smaller than I remembered, softer somehow, her silver hair pinned neatly back. The moment she saw my face, her expression changed. Fear. Not concern. Fear. "Abby." "Mom, I need to talk to Dad." She hesitated. Then my father appeared behind her. Frank Reeves looked exactly as he always had, straight-backed iron gray hair, crisp button-down shirt tucked neatly into pressed slacks. Even retired, he dressed like the world was watching. His eyes landed on me, then narrowed. I saw the news. It isn't true. Military police don't show up for innocent people. I stared at him. "Dad, I'm being framed." He folded his arms. "You've brought enough shame to this family." The words landed harder than I expected. My mother looked down. Not defending me. Not saying my name. Just looking down. Then my father said the sentence I will never forget. "Don't drag our family name down with you." I laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "Are you serious?" Without answering, he stepped outside and dropped my old deployment duffel bag onto the porch. I stared at it. "What is this?" "We cleared out the things you left here." Confusion hit me first. Then dread. I reached for my phone and opened my banking app. Balance $413.72. I froze. Number. No. The account had held nearly $80,000. Savings from deployments. Combat pay. Years of careful planning for retirement. My father had co-signed emergency access years ago before my first deployment in case something happened overseas. I looked up at him, my pulse roaring in my ears. "You emptied my account." "We protected family assets from seizure." My mouth went dry. That was my money. It was under our family name. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, calm, as if discussing weather, "Never use our family name again." My mother began crying quietly behind him. But she said nothing. And somehow that hurt more. I picked up my duffel. No shouting. No pleading. Military training teaches control. So I turned and walked back to my car. I drove south until Maryland disappeared in the rearview mirror. By nightfall, I checked into a roadside motel off I-95 with faded floral bedspreads and humming fluorescent lights. And for the first time since I was 18 years old, I had nowhere to go. That was the night I realized something harder than betrayal. Sometimes the people who abandon you were never really standing with you at all. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. That smell stayed with me all week. Even now, months later, I sometimes catch a trace of disinfectant in a hospital hallway or an airport restroom, and I'm right back there sitting on the edge of that sagging mattress with my army duffel at my feet, staring at a future that had gone blank overnight. The first morning after my parents threw me out, I woke before dawn out of habit. For 21 years, reveille had been my clock, whether I was stationed in Virginia, South Korea, or halfway across a desert under blackout conditions. My body still expected purpose at 0500. Instead, there was only silence. No command schedule. No secure briefings. No morning reports waiting in my inbox. Just the buzz of the motel's ancient air conditioner and the sick feeling that my life had been paused by someone else's hand. I sat up slowly and reached for my phone. Nothing. No messages from command. No texts from colleagues. No calls from my parents. The isolation felt surgical, as if every thread connecting me to the world had been cut cleanly at once. For a while, I simply sat there and listened to the traffic passing on Interstate 95 beyond the window. Then discipline took over. I showered. Pressed my civilian clothes as neatly as I could. Made the bed. Small things. Order is often the only defense against panic. At 800 sharp, my temporary legal liaison called. Captain Laura Kim, Judge Advocate General's Corps. Her voice was professional but kind. Major Reeves, I've reviewed the preliminary allegations. And, a pause. This is unusual. That got my attention. How unusual. The access logs show your credentials authorized financial intelligence transfers at 02:17 hours last Thursday. I was asleep in my quarters. I know, base access logs confirm you never left your apartment. A quiet tension entered her voice. Someone either cloned your credentials or they had elevated system override access. I sat straighter. Which means this wasn't random. Number. For the first time since the MPS had appeared at my door, my fear sharpened into focus. I had spent years tracking financial fraud through military contracting systems. If someone had used my credentials to move classified financial records, they either wanted money or they wanted me blamed for finding something I shouldn't have. Laura's voice lowered. Officially, I shouldn't say more, but unofficially, Major, this smells wrong. After we hung up, I stared at the wall for a long time. Then I opened my notebook. Paper, pen, old school. When systems are compromised, analog survives. I began writing every case I'd touched in the last 6 months. Defense vendors. Logistics contractors. Supply chain discrepancies. Payment irregularities. Halfway down page 3, one name stopped me cold. Redstone Federal Logistics. 3 months earlier, I had flagged unusual transaction layering through their overseas subcontractors. Nothing dramatic at first glance, just enough inconsistency to suggest laundering if someone knew where to look. I had submitted a recommendation for expanded audit review. 2 days later, I'd been told higher command would handle it. Then silence. Now I was under investigation. My instincts stirred. This wasn't coincidence. At noon, there was a knock at my motel door. Every muscle tightened. When I opened it, Colonel Daniel Mercer stood there holding 2 coffees. Retired 3 years now, Mercer had once been my commanding officer and the closest thing I'd ever had to a professional father. Tall and broad even in his 60s, with silver hair cropped short and eyes that missed nothing, he looked exactly as he had the day he pinned my oak leaves on my uniform. "You look terrible," he said. I almost laughed. That obvious? Abigail, I've interrogated cartel financiers with better posture. That made me smile despite myself. He handed me coffee and stepped inside. We sat by the window while morning traffic hissed past outside. He listened while I told him everything. The MPs. My parents. The missing money. Redstone. When I finished, he was quiet. Then he nodded slowly. I was afraid of this. My stomach tightened. You know something? Not enough to prove anything. He folded his hands. 3 weeks ago, a friend at the Pentagon called me. Internal oversight had concerns about procurement fraud tied to Redstone and several shell contractors. I felt my pulse quicken. How high does it go? High enough that if you got close to exposing it, someone would notice. The room felt smaller. You think I was set up? I think someone with system-level access used your credentials because they knew your audit flags would make you believable. He leaned forward. Listen carefully, Abigail. Truth in Washington moves slow, but it always leaves footprints. That sentence settled into me like an anchor. For the first time all week, I could breathe. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't disgraced. I was inconvenient. And inconvenient people get erased if they stop paying attention. After Mercer left, I worked. Not officially. Not on any military system. But I knew enough about contractor reporting structures to map likely shell pathways by hand. Hours passed. Outside daylight faded to dusk. Around 7, my phone buzzed. Dad. I stared at his name. Frank Reeves had not called once to ask if I was safe. Not once. Now his name glowed across my screen like a command. I let it ring out. A minute later, voicemail. Then another call. Another voicemail. By midnight, there were 6. I didn't listen. Not yet. Instead, I sat by the motel window and watched headlights sweep across the parking lot. Somewhere out there, powerful people thought they had buried me. At the same time, somewhere north in Maryland, my father was calling with growing urgency. For reasons I didn't yet understand, both sides had suddenly remembered I existed. And experience had taught me one thing. When people who've ignored you suddenly need your attention, the truth is usually about to surface. I slept with my notebook open beside me. And for the first time since military police had pounded on my door, I dreamed not of losing everything, but of getting it back. The 7th call came at 6:14 the next morning. I was already awake, sitting at the little motel desk with my notebook open and a stale cup of coffee cooling beside me. Dawn was creeping through the thin curtains, laying pale stripes across the carpet. Dad's name flashed across my screen again. For a moment I considered ignoring it. Then I answered, "Hello." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to tell me he hadn't expected me to pick up. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded nothing like the cold, polished certainty I had grown up fearing. It was ragged, panicked. "Abigail." Not Abby. Not that clipped, dismissive tone he used whenever he wanted to remind me I'd disappointed him. My full name. Like he suddenly remembered I was a person. "What is it, Dad?" There was a sharp breath. Then he blurted, "The bank's taking the house." I said nothing. Behind him I could hear my mother crying. Cabinet doors opening and closing. The low murmur of the television. Then his voice sharpened into accusation. "What did you do?" For a moment I didn't understand what he meant. Then memory clicked into place. 7 years earlier, right before my second deployment overseas, my parents had asked me to help them refinance. Dad had framed it as temporary, a smart financial adjustment while interest rates were favorable. "Just co-sign," he'd said. "It'll help secure approval. You've got stable military income." I had signed without hesitation. Because he was my father. Because family was supposed to mean trust. What I hadn't known, what I had never thought to check, was that after the refinance, he had quietly tied the mortgage autopay to the emergency account he had access to. My account. The account he had emptied the day he threw me out. The realization settled slowly. Heavy. Clean. The money that had kept their house afloat had been mine all along. And when he drained it to protect family assets, he'd severed his own lifeline. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the motel wall. On the other end, my father was breathing hard. "Well," he snapped. For most of my life, that tone would have sent adrenaline through me, the reflexive need to explain, obey, fix whatever he believed I had broken. But something inside me had shifted on that porch in Maryland. Some old chain had finally snapped. I smiled. Not cruelly. Not triumphantly. Just with the quiet recognition of truth finally arriving exactly where it belonged. Then I ended the call. No speech. No accusation. No explanation. Just silence. The phone buzzed again immediately. I muted it and set it face down. Outside, the Virginia sky was turning gold with sunrise. For the first time in days, I felt calm. Not vindicated. Not healed. Just clear. Some lessons don't need to be taught with anger. Reality usually handles that part just fine. I showered, dressed, and walked across the motel parking lot to the little diner next door. The waitress, a woman in her 60s named Sharon, had started recognizing me by then. She poured coffee before I even sat down. "Rough week." I gave a tired smile. "You could say that." She nodded like she understood more than she asked. That's something I've always admired about older Americans. The best of them know when kindness matters more than curiosity. I was halfway through my eggs when the television above the counter switched from local weather to national news. The headline froze me in place. Pentagon procurement fraud investigation expands. The anchor's voice sharpened. Sources inside the Department of Defense now confirm widening inquiries into financial irregularities tied to Redstone Federal Logistics and affiliated contractors. My pulse kicked. Sharon noticed. "You okay, honey?" I didn't answer. On-screen file footage rolled of Redstone executives entering a federal building. Then my own photograph appeared. My official army portrait. The diner went very still. The anchor continued. Earlier reports suggested Major Abigail Reeves was under investigation for unauthorized system access. New information indicates Reeves may instead be central to uncovering the fraud itself. The room blurred for a second. I gripped the edge of the booth. The anchor kept speaking. Military investigators are now examining evidence that Major Reeves's credentials were duplicated by senior systems administrators linked to contractor oversight offices. A man at the counter turned and stared at me. Recognition dawned. I stood slowly. Then my phone exploded with notifications. Texts. Voicemails. News alerts. 27 missed calls. Most from numbers I knew. Former colleagues. Reporters. And my parents. The phone rang again. Dad. I let it ring. Again. Again. Then voicemail. I listened. His voice had changed. Gone was the accusation. Gone was the command. Now there was something almost unrecognizable. Fear and shame. Abby, he said quietly, please call us back. We didn't know. I stared at the message long after it ended. Then Colonel Mercer called. His voice was steady. They've arrested 2 oversight officials and frozen Redstone assets. I closed my eyes. It's over. Not quite. A pause. Then warmth entered his tone. But your name's been cleared, Major, officially. For a moment I couldn't breathe. 21 years of service. A lifetime spent proving myself. And now in one sentence my honor had been returned. I thought I'd feel triumph. Instead I felt grief. For the child who had spent decades chasing her father's approval. For the woman standing on that porch while her family turned her away. For all the years I had mistaken endurance for love. Mercer spoke again. You all right? I looked out the diner window at the brightening Virginia morning. And for the first time in my life I answered honestly. Yes. I think I finally am. By noon, every major news network in the country had my face on their screens. It was a strange thing watching your own army portrait appear beneath a chyron that read, Decorated Officer Cleared in Pentagon Fraud Case. I sat in the same diner booth where an hour earlier I had been a disgraced major hiding in plain sight. Now Sharon kept refilling my coffee while pretending not to stare. The regulars at the counter stole glances in my direction, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition to something like respect. I wasn't used to public attention. Military intelligence is built on invisibility. If people know your name, something has usually gone wrong. And for one long week, everything had. Now the truth was surfacing faster than anyone expected. The television anchor explained how investigators had uncovered an internal network of procurement fraud stretching through multiple oversight offices. Redstone Federal Logistics had funneled federal money through shell contractors for years. When I flagged irregularities in their overseas payment structures, 2 senior civilian administrators intercepted my audit requests. Then they cloned my credentials, falsified access logs, and used my profile as a scapegoat. The whole operation had nearly worked. Nearly. But one of the men they trusted, a systems analyst named Victor Salinas, had panicked after seeing how far they intended to push the cover-up. He had turned state's evidence before dawn. His testimony had broken everything open. By 11:30 that morning, federal agents had made arrests in Arlington and Washington. By noon, my suspension was formally lifted. At 12:14, my commanding general called personally. Lieutenant General Howard Whitaker was not a man known for softness. He had spent 37 years becoming exactly the kind of officer history books remember. His voice came through measured and precise. Major Reeves. Sir. A pause. Then, you have my apology. The words landed harder than I expected. I appreciate that, sir. No, he said quietly, you deserved better. I stared at the motel wallpaper while emotion tightened my throat. That was the thing about real leadership. It doesn't hide behind rank when it's wrong. Whitaker continued. You'll report to Fort Belvoir at 800 tomorrow in full dress uniform. There will be a formal reinstatement and commendation. Yes, sir. Another pause. Then his tone softened. Well done, Major. The line clicked dead. For several moments I simply sat there holding the phone. 21 years of service had taught me that praise from men like Whitaker was rare and carefully earned. But all I felt was tired. Deep down tired. The kind that settles into your bones after surviving something your mind still hasn't caught up to. The next call came 3 minutes later. Mom. I let it ring. Then voicemail. Her voice was shaking. "Abby, sweetheart, please call us. We were wrong. We didn't understand." A sob interrupted her. Then the message ended. I closed my eyes. The old ache rose instantly. That familiar pull to comfort her. To smooth over pain. To become the capable daughter who fixed everyone else's mistakes. But another voice, quieter and stronger, rose beside it. You do not owe people immediate access just because they suddenly regret hurting you. That truth felt foreign. Almost rebellious. And yet it steadied me. The calls continued all afternoon. Dad. Mom. Dad again. A text. Please, we need to talk. Another. The foreclosure notice was a mistake. There's more going on. Please call. I ignored them all. At 5 that evening, Colonel Mercer arrived at the motel. He wore jeans and a navy polo shirt, but somehow still looked like he was conducting command inspection. He handed me a garment bag. Inside was my dress blues. Pressed perfectly. Every ribbon aligned. Every insignia polished. I looked up. You had these cleaned, he shrugged. Thought you might need them. That nearly broke me. Not because of the uniform. Because he had noticed what I needed before I asked. That kind of quiet care still catches me off guard. Mercer sat across from me. You heard from your parents? I nodded. And, I don't know. He was silent for a while. Then he said something I've carried with me ever since. Abigail, forgiveness and access are not the same thing. I looked at him. He folded his hands. You can forgive someone someday and still refuse to let them keep hurting you today. The words settled somewhere deep. I thought about my father standing on that porch. About my mother looking away. About 20 years of trying to become enough for people who only measured worth by usefulness. And for the first time I considered a possibility I had never allowed myself before. Maybe I didn't need their approval to belong to myself. That night alone in the motel room, I carefully hung my uniform on the closet door. The dark blue fabric caught the yellow lamplight. Brass buttons gleamed. Rows of ribbons marked 2 decades of service, sacrifice, and endurance. For years I had worn that uniform, hoping my father might one day see it and understand my worth. Now I understood something better. Its value had never depended on his recognition. At 7:42 the phone rang again. Dad. This time I answered. He inhaled sharply. Abigail. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I said nothing. Then he spoke the words I never thought Frank Reeves would say. I was wrong. Silence stretched between us. Then quietly, I should have trusted my daughter. Something inside me shifted. Not healed. Not whole. But softened. And for the first time since this began, I wondered if shame had finally reached him the way fear never could. I didn't forgive him that night. But I listened. And sometimes listening is the first crack where grace begins to enter. The next morning I stood in front of the motel mirror and buttoned my dress blues, one careful fastening at a time. The motions were automatic. Precise. Familiar. For 21 years this uniform had marked every turning point of my adult life. Promotions. Deployments. Funerals. Homecomings. Victories no civilian would ever hear about. And now somehow it marked this too. Reclamation. I adjusted the ribbons across my chest and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back looked older than she had 2 weeks earlier. Not physically. Something deeper. As though betrayal had burned away the last traces of someone who still believed love could be earned through performance. Outside, Virginia's early sunlight spilled across the motel parking lot. Colonel Mercer was waiting beside his truck, coffee in hand. He looked me over and gave one sharp nod. About time the Army remembered who you are. That made me smile. The drive to Fort Belvoir was quiet. Mercer understood the value of silence. Older soldiers know that some moments deserve room to settle. When we reached post, military police waved us through the gate with formal salutes. A week earlier, another set of MPS had stripped my authority at my apartment door. Now those same gates opened to welcome me back. Life has a way of restoring balance when truth finally catches up. The ceremony was held in the command auditorium. Nothing extravagant. 100 seats. Flags arranged at the front. Rows of officers and civilian staff already seated when I entered. The room rose as one. For a moment I stopped walking. I hadn't expected that. General Whitaker stood near the podium. He met my eyes and gave the slightest nod. It wasn't ceremony. It was respect. I moved forward and took my place. The general's remarks were brief and direct. He spoke about duty, integrity, the cost of institutional failure when good people are doubted too quickly. Then he turned toward me. Major Abigail Reeves acted exactly as an officer should. Her vigilance exposed one of the most serious procurement fraud operations this command has seen in decades. His voice sharpened. We failed her before verifying the truth. That failure will not happen again. The room was utterly still. Then he pinned the Legion of Merit medal to my jacket. As his hand withdrew, he said quietly enough that only I could hear, "You honored the uniform better than we honored you." Emotion rose so suddenly I nearly lost my composure. But Army discipline held. I saluted. He returned it. The applause that followed was long and steady. And all I could think was this. My father had spent 40 years teaching me that approval had to be earned through perfection. Yet here among people who had every reason to judge harshly acknowledgement had arrived not because I was flawless, but because I had endured truthfully. After the ceremony, officers approached one by one. Some apologized. Some simply shook my hand. Others said nothing at all, their expressions carrying more sincerity than words ever could. Then I saw my phone. 32 missed calls. 20 from my parents. One voicemail had arrived during the ceremony. I stepped into an empty hallway and played it. Dad's voice came through rough and uneven. "Abigail, the sheriff posted final foreclosure papers this morning." A shaky breath followed. "We have 48 hours. Silence." Then, "I know I don't deserve to ask this, but your mother's terrified." His voice cracked. And suddenly, impossibly, I heard not the commanding father of my childhood, but an aging man confronting consequences he no longer knew how to control. He continued, "I was wrong about everything." A pause. Then the sentence that undid me. "I was so afraid of being ashamed of you, I never noticed how proud I should have been." The voicemail ended. I stood there staring at the blank screen. For years, those were the words I had wanted. A child can survive on very little hope if she believes love is still possible. And now here they were arriving decades late and spoken through defeat. Colonel Mercer found me standing there. He read my expression immediately. "What happened?" I handed him the phone. He listened quietly. When it ended, he looked up. "What are you thinking?" I stared down the long, polished hallway of Fort Belvoir, at young officers walking briskly toward work, at the life I had fought to reclaim. Then I answered honestly, "I think I'm tired of letting pain make my decisions." Mercer said nothing. He didn't need to. By afternoon, I was driving north to Maryland. The highway stretched ahead beneath a pale autumn sky. Every mile carried memory. Family road trips. High school debates with my father. The long drive home after West Point graduation when he had said, "Not bad," like it was praise enough to last a lifetime. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, dusk had settled. The foreclosure notice was taped to the front door. The American flag still hung neatly from the porch. But the house itself looked smaller somehow. Fragile. Like pride had been the only thing holding it upright. I stepped out of the car. And for the first time in my life, I approached that front door with nothing left to prove. The porch light was already on when I walked up the front steps. For a second, my hand hovered over the same brass doorbell I had pressed a week earlier. That morning, I had stood here frightened, disgraced, and desperate for comfort. Tonight, I stood here restored. Not because the Army had cleared my name. Not because the uniform on my shoulders carried fresh recognition. But because somewhere between losing everything and getting it back, I had stopped measuring my worth by whether this door opened for me. I pressed the bell. Footsteps shuffled inside. Then the door opened. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Frank Reeves had always filled a room through sheer force of certainty. Even in retirement, he carried himself like a man who believed control was his birthright. That certainty was gone now. His shoulders sagged. His neatly combed gray hair looked thinner. The skin beneath his eyes had hollowed into shadows. And when he saw me standing there in full dress blues, his face folded in on itself. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped aside. "Please come in." The house smelled exactly as it had my entire childhood lemon-polish old books and my mother's lavender hand soap. The familiarity hit harder than I expected. Memory is a strange thing. It can ache even when attached to pain. Mom stood in the living room near the fireplace, twisting a handkerchief between trembling fingers. The moment she saw me, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Abby," I gave a small nod. Not cold, not warm, simply present. She crossed the room and stopped a few feet away as though uncertain she had the right to come closer. That hurt more than anger would have, because it meant she knew what she'd done. We sat in the living room where I had opened Christmas gifts as a child and studied for SAT exams under my father's stern supervision. Now silence filled every corner. Finally, Dad spoke. The bank accelerated the foreclosure after Redstone's assets were frozen. I frowned. "What does Redstone have to do with your mortgage?" His expression tightened. Then shame darkened his face. Years seemed to settle into him all at once. He looked suddenly old. 3 years ago, he said quietly, "I invested our retirement funds with a private equity group." A sick feeling stirred in my stomach. He kept going. "They promised stable returns, conservative growth. They were backed through Redstone affiliates." Of course they were. Contractor shell money laundering often flowed through respectable-looking retirement instruments. For older investors, it was a familiar trap trust, the polished men with brochures and percentages. Dad stared at his hands. "When your account became accessible, I used it to cover our mortgage while waiting for the investments to recover." I felt something inside me go still. Not rage. Not even shock. Just clarity. For years, he had quietly depended on my money while presenting himself as the provider. The man who had lectured me about responsibility had been surviving on my sacrifices while calling it family stewardship. Mom's voice broke through. "I knew some of it." I looked at her. She wept openly now. I told myself he'd fix it. I told myself families help each other. But I knew it wasn't right. There it was. The truth at last. Not monsters. Not villains. Just frightened people whose pride had slowly made cowards of them. Dad looked up at me then, and his voice cracked. "I emptied your account because I panicked." He swallowed hard. "When the military investigation hit the news, I thought everything would be seized. I thought if I protected what was left." "What was left?" I asked quietly. He flinched. The question hung there. What was left after years of taking from a daughter he had never truly seen? Tears filled his eyes. The sight stunned me. Frank Reeves did not cry. Not when his own father died. Not when Mom survived breast cancer. Not when I deployed to Afghanistan. But now tears slipped down his face unchecked. And he whispered the words I never thought I would hear. "I threw away my child to save a house and still lost both." The room went silent. I looked at this man who had shaped so much of my life through absence disguised as discipline. And for the first time I saw him clearly. Not as the giant whose approval I had chased. Not as the judge whose standards defined me. Just an aging man who had spent his life worshipping control until it cost him the very people he meant to protect. And suddenly I pitied him. Real pity. Not contempt. Not triumph. Mercy. I stood. Both of them looked up frightened I was leaving. Instead, I walked to the front window and looked out at the dark street where I'd once learned to ride a bicycle under my father's watchful eye. Then I turned back. "I can stop the foreclosure." Neither of them moved. Dad's face drained of color. "Why?" It was a fair question. After everything, why? I thought about Colonel Mercer's words. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. Then I answered. Because if I let bitterness decide who I become, then this wins twice. Mom covered her mouth and sobbed. Dad stared at me like he no longer recognized the daughter standing before him. Maybe he didn't. The frightened girl who once begged for scraps of his approval was gone. In her place stood a woman who had finally learned this. Mercy offered freely is not weakness. It is freedom. The next morning I wired enough money to halt proceedings. Not to erase the past. Not to pretend trust was restored overnight, but to make room for something better than revenge. That evening, after the paperwork cleared, Dad met me at the front door as I prepared to leave. His eyes were red. His hands shook slightly. For a moment he said nothing. Then very softly he spoke my full name. "Welcome home, Abigail Reeves." Not ownership. Not expectation. Just pride. At last freely given. I smiled. And this time when he opened his arms, I stepped into them. Some wounds never fully disappear. But healing begins the moment we stop asking pain to tell us who we are. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you've ever had to choose grace when anger felt easier, I hope you'll carry that reflection with you, and perhaps share it with someone who needs it. And if stories like this remind you that it's never too late for truth healing and second chances, I'd be honored if you stayed for the next one. The room went silent the moment the camera zoomed in on the cockpit. My brother dropped his beer. My mother covered her mouth. My father leaned forward so quickly that his recliner nearly tipped. And for the first time in years, nobody said a word. On the television screen, the announcer's voice echoed across the living room. Leading today's demonstration flight is Major Emily Parker. My name, my face, my aircraft. Broadcast live to millions of Americans. The same brother who had called me the family failure stared at the screen as if he'd seen a ghost. The same parents who had spent years defending him couldn't look away. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because the pilot flying across the sky wasn't some stranger. It was me, the daughter they'd overlooked, the sister they'd underestimated, the woman they'd stopped believing in years ago. And the strangest part? I had never lied to them. Not once. They simply never cared enough to ask. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back long before the television cameras, back before the Air Force, back before the uniforms, back before the air shows, back to a small town in Texas, back to the day my brother's dream became my burden, and eventually, my future. My name is Emily Parker. I'm 34 years old now, but this story really began when I was a little girl growing up outside Wichita Falls, Texas. Back then, everybody knew who Jake Parker was. Jake was my older brother. 3 years older, 3 years louder, 3 years more confident, and according to nearly everyone who knew us, 3 years more talented. If there was a baseball game, Jake was the star. If there was a school event, Jake got attention. If there was a family gathering, relatives asked about Jake first. I wasn't ignored exactly. I was simply second. Second place becomes familiar when you're the younger sibling of someone everybody expects great things from. The funny thing is that I adored him. I really did. When I was 7 years old, I wanted to wear the same baseball cap he wore. When I was 10, I copied the way he talked. When I was 12, I followed him around so much that he started calling me his shadow. Most little sisters probably understand that feeling. The desire to be included, the desire to belong, the desire to hear an older sibling say they were proud of you. Back then, Jake was my hero. And Jake had one dream: flying. He loved airplanes. Loved them. Our bedroom walls were covered with aircraft posters. Fighter jets, bombers. Military aviation magazines stacked everywhere. Air shows were practically holidays in our family. Every summer, Dad loaded us into the truck before sunrise. We'd drive for hours just to watch military aircraft roar across the Texas sky. Jake would stand there with his eyes locked on the horizon, completely mesmerized. One year after watching an F-16 demonstration team perform, he turned to Dad and said something I'll never forget. "One day that'll be me." Dad smiled. "I believe it." Mom smiled too. So do I. Nobody laughed. Nobody doubted him. Not for a second. And honestly, neither did I. Because Jake had the kind of confidence that made other people believe. As we got older, the dream only grew. Jake joined Civil Air Patrol, earned flight experience, studied aviation constantly. Everything in his life pointed toward becoming a military pilot. By high school, teachers talked about him like he was already destined for greatness. The future seemed written. Then reality arrived. It arrived quietly, in the form of a medical examination. I was 15 when it happened. Jake was 18. I remember the day he came home. No excitement, no smile, no celebration, just silence. The kind of silence that tells you something important has broken. Dad sat with him at the kitchen table for hours. Mom cried. Nobody explained anything to me. Not immediately. I eventually learned the truth. Jake had failed a medical qualification required for the flight path he wanted. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked skill. His body simply didn't meet the standard. Years of dreaming ended in a single appointment. Just like that, the Air Force dream disappeared, and something inside Jake disappeared with it. The months afterward were difficult, harder than anyone expected. Jake became angry, then withdrawn, then bitter. Not all at once, slowly, like watching a storm gather in the distance. At first everyone understood, even me. Losing a dream hurts, especially when you've built your identity around it. Mom and Dad became protective, extremely protective. Every conversation revolved around Jake. Every family decision revolved around Jake. Every concern revolved around Jake. Again, I understood, at least initially. But over time, something changed. The family didn't just comfort him. They began excusing him. Everything. His temper, his attitude, his mistakes, his complaints. No matter what happened, the explanation was always the same. He's been through a lot, and he had. But eventually that explanation became permission. Permission to stay angry. Permission to blame others. Permission to stop moving forward. Meanwhile, life kept moving, including mine. One afternoon while helping Dad clean the garage, I found an old aviation magazine. The cover featured an Air Force pilot climbing into a fighter jet. I stared at the image for several minutes. Something stirred inside me. The same feeling Jake used to talk about. The same excitement. The same fascination. That night, I started researching military aviation. Quietly. Secretly. I never told anyone. Not even Jake. Especially not Jake, because by then I already knew how he'd react. The dream belonged to him, not me. At least that's what everyone seemed to believe. Years passed. I graduated high school, worked hard, stayed focused, made plans. Whenever I talked about military service, Jake rolled his eyes. Whenever I talked about aviation, he laughed. The first time he called me the family failure, I was 21. We were sitting around the dinner table. I had just mentioned applying for officer training. Jake smirked. That's ambitious. Dad looked uncomfortable. Mom stared at her plate. I ignored the comment. Then Jake laughed. You've always been the family failure, Emily. Silence. Nobody corrected him. Nobody defended me. Nobody said a word. The silence hurt more than the insult, because silence can sound a lot like agreement. I looked around the table. My parents avoided eye contact. Jake leaned back in his chair, satisfied. And that's when I learned an important lesson. Sometimes the people who should protect you simply don't. Not because they don't love you, because they're too busy protecting someone else. I never argued, never fought back, never demanded fairness. I simply smiled and kept moving forward. Because while my family was still focused on the dream Jake lost, I was quietly preparing to chase it myself, and none of them had any idea how far I was willing to go. The first time I sat in the cockpit of a military training aircraft, I thought about my brother. Not because he was there. He wasn't. Not because he supported me. He didn't. I thought about him because I knew I was sitting inside the dream he had wanted his entire life. And for a brief moment I felt guilty. That feeling didn't last long. Reality has a way of pushing sentiment aside, especially when you're trying not to fail. When people imagine military flight training, they often picture excitement, speed, adventure, the kind of scenes you see in movies. The truth is much less glamorous. Most days were exhausting. Long hours, constant evaluations, endless studying, pressure that never seemed to disappear. I joined the Air Force shortly after college. At first, nobody in my family took it seriously. Mom assumed it was temporary. Dad thought I'd eventually come home. Jake laughed outright. How long before you quit? I remember that question clearly. We were standing in my parents' driveway. The Texas sun was setting. I'd just finished loading my luggage into the trunk of my car. I looked at him. I'm not quitting. He shrugged. We'll see. That was it. No good luck. No encouragement. No brotherly support. Just doubt. The strange thing is that by then I'd become accustomed to it. Low expectations are surprisingly easy to carry once you've carried them long enough. Military life changed me quickly. Not because it made me tougher, because it forced me to discover how tough I already was. The first year was difficult. Really difficult. There were moments I questioned everything. Moments when failure seemed more likely than success. The standards were demanding. The competition was intense. Everyone around me had talent. Everyone around me wanted the same opportunities. Nobody cared about excuses. Nobody cared about your feelings. Results mattered. Performance mattered. Discipline mattered. And I loved it. For the first time in my life, nobody compared me to Jake. Nobody saw me as somebody's little sister. Nobody viewed me through the lens of family history. I was simply Emily Parker. responsible for my own success, responsible for my own failures. It was strangely liberating. One evening during training, I found myself sitting alone outside the barracks. The sun had disappeared. The air was cool. Several aircraft were parked in the distance. Their silhouettes stood against the darkening sky. I remember staring at them for a long time, thinking about home, thinking about family, thinking about the version of myself everyone back in Texas still believed existed. The family failure. The girl who would never accomplish much. The girl nobody worried about because she wasn't the important one. It struck me then how strange life can be. The people who know us longest don't always know us best. Sometimes they become attached to an old version of who we were, even after we've changed, even after we've grown, even after we've become someone entirely different. Bull. Meanwhile, Jake remained the center of gravity back home. At least according to my parents. Every phone call followed the same pattern. Mom would spend 20 minutes talking about Jake, his job, his frustrations, his latest problem, his newest plan. Then she'd ask about me, briefly. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just habit. Years of family dynamics are hard to break. One Christmas I returned home on leave. The visit lasted 4 days. By the second evening, Jake had already found a way to mock my career. We were sitting in the living room watching football. A commercial featuring military aircraft appeared on television. Jake pointed toward the screen. "Remember when I wanted to do that?" Nobody answered. He looked at me. "I guess somebody had to settle for second place." Mom laughed nervously. Dad cleared his throat. Nobody challenged him. Again. I sat quietly. Again. The silence no longer surprised me. What surprised me was how little it hurt. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped needing their approval. Not completely, but enough. Enough to keep moving. Enough to stay focused. Enough to understand that their opinion wasn't my future. The irony was that Jake himself had inspired my love of aviation. I don't think he ever realized that. When we were kids, I followed him everywhere. Air museums, aviation shows, books about fighter jets, flight simulators. Every interest he loved eventually became something I loved too. The difference was simple. When his path closed, he stopped walking. When mine became difficult, I kept going. That wasn't because I was stronger. It was because by the time I started, I already knew nobody was coming to save me. Nobody was going to carry me. Nobody was going to lower the standards. The responsibility belonged to me. And somehow that made all the difference. So, several years passed. My career advanced steadily. I earned qualifications, completed advanced training, accepted increasingly challenging assignments. Each accomplishment felt meaningful. Not because anyone back home noticed, because I knew how hard I'd worked for it. Success feels different when you've earned it quietly. There's no applause, no celebration, no audience, just private satisfaction. The knowledge that you kept your promises to yourself. One afternoon, I received a call from my mother. The conversation began normally. Weather, family news, small-town gossip. Then she casually mentioned Jake. "He's been having a rough time lately." I wasn't surprised. There always seemed to be something. "What happened?" "Work isn't going well." I listened. As always. Then she sighed. "You know, your brother had such big dreams." The comment wasn't intended to hurt me, but it did. Because I realized something. Even after all these years, my family still viewed Jake as the dreamer. The one with potential. The one whose future mattered. Meanwhile, I was actively living the life he'd once wanted. And somehow they still didn't see it. Not because I hid it. Because they never looked. A few months later, everything changed. I was stationed at an Air Force base in Nevada when the email arrived. At first, I assumed it was routine. Another administrative notice. Another scheduling update. Something ordinary. Instead, it contained an invitation. An opportunity. The kind of opportunity military aviators spend years hoping for. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. My hands were shaking slightly by the time I finished. Because the selection board had chosen me for something extraordinary. Something prestigious. Something that would place me on a national stage. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen, unable to process it. Then I thought about Jake, about my parents, about every family dinner where I'd been overlooked, about every joke, every dismissal, every moment of silence, and for the first time I wondered what would happen if they ever discovered who I had become. For most of my career, I believed success would feel dramatic. I imagined some life-changing moment, a celebration, a speech, a crowd applauding. Instead, one of the biggest moments of my life happened in a quiet office while I sat alone in front of a computer screen. No audience. No music. No fanfare. Just an email. And a future I never saw coming. Thought. I must have read the message 10 times. Maybe more. The words never changed. Neither did the outcome. I had been selected for one of the most prestigious aviation demonstration assignments in the Air Force. The selection process was brutally competitive. Outstanding pilots from across the service applied. Most never made it. Many applied more than once. Some spent years hoping for the opportunity. And somehow my name had ended up on the list. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. Aircraft moved across the flight line outside. Maintenance crews worked beneath the Nevada sun. Everything looked exactly the same. But nothing felt the same. Because after years of quiet effort, somebody had noticed. Somebody had looked beyond evaluations and flight hours and seen potential. The realization was overwhelming. Not because I needed validation. Because I'd spent so many years without it. That evening I called my parents. Part of me wanted to share the news. Part of me still hoped. Even after all those years, even after all the disappointments, there is something inside most daughters that never fully stops wanting their parents to be proud. Mom answered on the second ring. We exchanged the usual greetings. Talked about weather, neighbors, family updates. Then I told her, I got selected for something important. Oh, there was genuine interest in her voice. I smiled. One of the biggest opportunities of my career. That's wonderful, honey. For a moment I felt encouraged. Then she asked, did I tell you Jake is thinking about changing jobs? And just like that, the moment disappeared. Not because she meant to hurt me. Because old habits are powerful. The conversation drifted back toward Jake, as it always seemed to. 20 minutes later, we hung up. I sat staring at my phone. Not angry. Not even disappointed. Mostly resigned. I understood my family by then. The rules rarely changed. The following months became some of the busiest of my life. The new assignment required additional preparation, additional training, additional responsibilities. The standards were higher. The expectations were higher. Everything was higher. I loved every minute of it. The work demanded precision, professionalism, discipline. Every detail mattered. Every maneuver mattered. Every decision mattered. There was no room for complacency. And strangely enough, that made me feel alive. Because for years I had quietly carried other people's expectations. Now I was focused entirely on my own. Back home, however, very little changed, at least not from my family's perspective. Whenever I visited Texas, I seemed to step back into the same role. The overlooked daughter, the younger sister, the safe target. One summer afternoon, my parents hosted a family barbecue, the kind of gathering common across America. Paper plates, lawn chairs, children running through sprinklers, country music playing softly in the background. Everybody relaxed, everybody comfortable, at least until Jake arrived. By then he was 37, still charismatic, still funny, still capable of making an entire group laugh. The difference was that the laughter felt different now, less joyful, more defensive. Success had never fully replaced the dream he'd lost, and I think part of him knew it. I was helping Dad near the grill when Jake walked over. Emily. Jake. He glanced at my sunglasses, then at my Air Force shirt. A familiar smirk appeared. I knew what was coming. Some things never change. So how's the military? It's good. You still doing that? I laughed softly. Last time I checked, several relatives nearby chuckled. Jake shook his head dramatically. I figured you'd be tired of playing soldier by now. The conversation around us grew quieter. People sensed tension. They always did. Nobody intervened. They rarely did. I looked at him. I like what I do. He shrugged. Good for you. Then he took a sip of his drink. And here I thought you'd eventually get a real job. Several people laughed awkwardly. The kind of laughter people use when they don't know what else to do. I noticed my mother looking down. My father focusing on the grill. Neither said anything. Again. The moment should have hurt. Years earlier it would have. Instead I found myself feeling something unexpected. Pity. Not for myself. For Jake. Because I suddenly realized he was still fighting a battle that had ended years ago. The dream was gone. The disappointment was real. But he refused to leave that chapter behind. And it was costing him. That evening, after most of the guests had gone home, I sat alone on my parents' back porch. The Texas sky stretched endlessly overhead. Crickets filled the darkness. The air smelled like cut grass and barbecue smoke. Dad eventually joined me. For several minutes we sat quietly. Then he sighed. Your brother gives you a hard time. I smiled. A little. He stared toward the yard. You know he doesn't mean all of it. There it was. The familiar defense. The explanation. The excuse. I had heard versions of it for years. Normally, I let it pass. This time I didn't. Dad, yeah. When was the last time somebody asked him to stop? The question lingered. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked away. And that answer told me everything. A few weeks later, a major television network announced coverage of an upcoming national air show. The event would attract enormous attention. Millions of viewers. National exposure. The kind of aviation spectacle people planned weekends around. I knew immediately that my family would watch. Jake never missed an air show. Never. Even after all these years. Especially not one this big. The irony wasn't lost on me. The little girl who had followed her brother through aviation museums and air shows was now preparing to fly in one. Not as a spectator. Not as a fan. As part of the show itself. Yet nobody back home knew. Not Jake. Not Mom. Not Dad. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in telling them. Because some truths don't need announcements. Sometimes life reveals them on its own. And when it does, the lesson tends to be unforgettable. The morning of the air show began long before sunrise. Most people only see the performance.
The aircraft.
The smoke trails. The precision formations. The applause. They don't see the preparation. The briefings. The inspections. The hours of planning. The responsibility. And they certainly don't see the quiet moments when a pilot sits alone and realizes thousands, sometimes millions of people are about to watch. I remember standing beside the aircraft while the sky was still dark. The air was cool. The flight line lights reflected against polished metal. Ground crews moved efficiently around us. Everything felt calm, professional, routine. Yet beneath that routine was excitement. Not nervous excitement, gratitude. Because I knew exactly how many people would have traded places with me. Including my brother. A few hundred miles away, my family was starting their day too. Though I wouldn't learn the details until later. According to my mother, Jake arrived early, earlier than anyone expected. He carried coffee and donuts, the way he used to whenever a big air show was on television. Apparently he was excited, like a kid again. That part made me smile when I heard it later. Because despite everything, Jake had never stopped loving aviation. Not really. He had simply stopped believing it could be part of his own future. Those are very different things. Back at the airfield, pilots gathered for the final briefing. Weather, safety procedures, flight schedules, communication plans, the usual details. Everyone focused. Everyone professional. Nobody treated the day casually. The crowd expected perfection. And perfection requires preparation. As the briefing concluded, one of the senior officers looked around the room, then smiled. Let's give them a show they'll remember. The room responded with quiet confidence. Not arrogance. Professional pride. There is a difference. Meanwhile, my parents had settled into the living room. My father occupied his favorite recliner. My mother sat on the couch. Jake claimed the seat closest to the television. Some things never change. The network coverage began around noon. Commentators discussed aircraft, pilots, history, upcoming demonstrations. Jake reportedly corrected the announcers several times, at least according to my mother. That sounded exactly like him. For all his flaws, he knew aviation. Always had. He pointed out aircraft models, explained maneuvers, shared facts nobody else knew. For a little while, the old Jake returned. The enthusiastic boy from those childhood air shows. The brother I used to admire. The brother I missed. By early afternoon, I was climbing into the cockpit. That moment never gets old. The smell, the equipment, the routine. Every pilot develops habits, personal rituals, small actions that signal it's time to focus. I followed mine carefully. Checklists, communications, systems, everything exactly as trained, everything exactly as practiced. Then I looked out across the airfield. Thousands of spectators filled the viewing areas. Families, veterans, children, aviation enthusiasts, people from all over America. Some wore military hats decorated with unit patches. Others carried folding chairs and cameras. Many had been attending air shows for decades. I felt honored to be there, truly. Because opportunities like this don't belong to one person. They're built on years of support from instructors, mentors, crews, and teammates. Nobody reaches that stage alone. The demonstration began. Aircraft launched. Formations assembled. The performance unfolded exactly as planned. From the cockpit, the world looked different. Cleaner. Simpler. Focused. There is a unique clarity that comes during flight. The noise disappears. The distractions disappear. Only the mission remains. For a while, family never entered my mind. Neither did Jake. I was too busy flying. Too busy doing the job? Back in Texas, the television broadcast continued. The commentators introduced various segments. Different aircraft. Different pilots. Different demonstrations. My family watched casually. Interested. Entertained. Completely unaware of what was coming. Then the production team switched to a featured segment. A closer look at one of the demonstration pilots. The camera followed a pilot walking toward an aircraft. Helmet under one arm. Flight gear perfectly fitted. Professional. Confident. The announcer began speaking. And everything changed. According to my father, Jake stopped moving first. Not speaking. Not breathing. Moving. The announcer continued. Leading today's demonstration is Major Emily Parker. My name. Clear as day. Impossible to misunderstand. My mother later told me she thought she'd heard it wrong. She looked at the screen. Then looked again. Then sat frozen. The camera zoomed closer. Close enough to remove all doubt. There I was. Not someone who looked like me. Not someone with the same name. Me. The daughter. The sister. The family failure. Elio. The room went completely silent. Nobody knew what to say. For years, they had imagined my military career as something small, ordinary, temporary. Background noise. Now reality was sitting in their living room. Broadcast nationwide. Impossible to ignore. The silence lasted several seconds. Maybe longer. Nobody remembers exactly. Shock has a strange effect on time. The aircraft accelerated. The demonstration continued. And for the next several minutes, my family watched without speaking. Every maneuver. Every formation. Every pass across the sky. Jake never looked away. Neither did my parents. Years of assumptions were collapsing in real time. The daughter they overlooked. The sister they underestimated. The dream they thought belonged only to Jake. All of it unfolding before them. Not through an argument. Not through revenge. Not through confrontation. Through truth. When the broadcast ended, nobody rushed to speak. Nobody joked. Nobody changed the subject. The room remained quiet. My father eventually stood. Walked into the kitchen. Then came back. Still speechless. My mother wiped tears from her eyes. Jake remained seated, staring at the blank television screen. The same screen that had just revealed everything. The next morning, while I was reviewing post-event schedules at my temporary quarters, somebody knocked on the door. A firm knock. Unexpected. I opened it, and found my brother standing there. He looked exhausted. Like a man who hadn't slept. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Jake took a deep breath, and said the last thing I ever expected to hear from him. We need to talk. For most of my life, I imagined what I would say if Jake ever admitted he was wrong. I pictured arguments, long speeches, years of frustration finally pouring out. I imagined telling him exactly how much he'd hurt me, exactly how many family dinners I'd endured, exactly how many times I'd sat quietly while everyone acted as if my life didn't matter. But when I opened that door and saw him standing there, none of those speeches seemed important anymore. Because Jake didn't look like a man ready to argue. He looked like a man carrying something heavy. Something he'd been carrying for years. Can I come in? He asked. I stepped aside. Sure. The room was quiet. Small. Temporary. Military housing isn't glamorous. Never has been. Jake looked around. His eyes settled on framed photographs sitting on a shelf. Flight school. Graduation ceremonies. Squadron pictures.
Awards.
Years of memories. Years of work. Evidence of a life he had never bothered to ask about. For several moments he simply stared. Then he shook his head. I didn't know. No, I said gently. You didn't. We sat across from each other at a small kitchen table, the same way we'd sat across from each other at hundreds of family meals. Yet this felt entirely different. For once nobody else was there. No parents. No relatives. No audience. Just us. Jake folded his hands together, then unfolded them, then folded them again. A nervous habit I'd almost forgotten he had. Finally he spoke. When did all this happen? I smiled. What part? He gestured toward the photographs. The career. The flying. The air show. I laughed softly. Over the last 12 years, the answer wasn't meant to be sarcastic. But it landed that way anyway. Because the truth was obvious. My life hadn't been a secret. He simply hadn't been paying attention. Jake stared down at the table. I feel stupid. I considered that. then shook my head. No. His eyes lifted. No. No, I think you're finally being honest. That answer seemed to surprise him. For several seconds he sat quietly. Then he nodded. Fair enough. The conversation moved slowly after that, like two people trying to cross a damaged bridge. Carefully, one step at a time. Eventually, Jake leaned back in his chair. I hated watching that air show. The statement caught me off guard. Hated it. He nodded. I was proud of you. Then he looked away, and I hated it. Now I understood. Not because I shared his feelings, because I finally understood their source. Why, I asked. Jake laughed bitterly. Because that was supposed to be me. There it was. The truth. Not jealousy. Not really. Grief. Old grief. Unresolved grief. The kind people carry so long they forget they're carrying it. For the next hour, Jake talked more honestly than I had ever heard him talk before. He told me about the medical disqualification, the embarrassment, the humiliation, the feeling of watching his future disappear. I already knew most of the facts. What I didn't know were the emotions behind them. The fear, the shame, the anger, the loneliness. For years, everyone had focused on the dream he lost. Very few people had focused on the person who lost it, including Jake himself. I kept thinking I'd find something else, he admitted. Something that felt the same. Did you? He shook his head. No, the answer came immediately. Too immediately. The kind of answer somebody has lived with for years. I got jobs. He shrugged. I made money. I paid bills. But none of it ever felt like flying. I nodded, understanding more than he realized. Because every person reaches a point where they discover the difference between making a living and feeling alive. Jake never found the second part. Then his eyes met mine. And then there was you. I stayed quiet. You kept going. Another pause. You lived the dream. The words sounded painful, but also freeing. Like finally admitting something he'd spent years avoiding. I nodded slowly. Yes. For the first time in my life, I didn't minimize it. Didn't soften it. Didn't apologize for it. I had earned it. And both of us knew it. Jake rubbed his face. I think I started blaming you. The honesty startled me, even though I'd suspected it for years. You? He nodded. It didn't make sense. I knew that. But every time you succeeded, his voice trailed off. I finished the sentence for him. It reminded you. He nodded. Exactly. Every achievement, every promotion, every step forward had reminded him of the path he'd lost. And because he couldn't fight the loss, he fought the reminder. Me. The strange thing was that hearing the truth didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Because I suddenly saw how much energy he'd wasted. Years of resentment. Years of comparison. Years spent staring backward instead of forward. And for what? Nothing. Not 1 minute of it had changed the past. A few days later, our parents joined us for dinner. The atmosphere was awkward at first. Nobody quite knew how to begin. Then my mother surprised everyone, including herself. She started crying. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of crying that comes from realization. We failed you, she said. I blinked. What? She looked directly at me. We failed you. The room went silent. Dad stared at the table. Jake looked down. Mom continued. We were so worried about your brother. Her voice trembled. We forgot you needed us too. I didn't know what to say. Because I'd imagined apologies before. Many times. But reality felt different. Messier. More human. Less satisfying. And somehow more meaningful. Dad finally spoke. We thought we were helping him. You were, I said. He nodded. Maybe. Then he sighed. But we stopped seeing what it was costing you. Nobody argued. Because everybody knew it was true. Eventually the conversation softened. The tension eased. The honesty remained. For the first time in years, we weren't pretending. And that mattered. More than revenge. More than being right. More than winning. Before leaving that evening, Jake walked me to my car. The sun was beginning to set. The sky glowed orange over the Texas horizon. He stood quietly for a moment, then asked a question. A simple question, but one that carried the weight of years. Why didn't you ever tell us? I looked at him, and for the first time I knew exactly how to answer. For years I thought I knew exactly how I would answer that question. Why didn't you ever tell us? I imagined saying something dramatic, something sharp, something that would finally make everyone understand. But standing there beside my car looking at my brother, I realized the answer was much simpler than that. I did tell you. Jake frowned. What? I told you every time somebody asked. The confusion remained. So I smiled. I joined the Air Force. He nodded. I know. I told you when I graduated training. Another nod. I told you when I got promoted. Yeah, I told you when I changed assignments. His expression slowly shifted. The pieces were finally connecting. I wasn't talking about secrets. I was talking about attention. For years, the information had been available. Nobody had listened. Not really. Not completely. Not with genuine curiosity. Jake stared toward the fading horizon, then laughed quietly. A sad laugh. The kind people make when they finally recognize a truth they'd spent years avoiding. We never asked. No, we didn't. And somehow those 3 words carried more honesty than anything he'd said before. Oh, on the flight home the next day I spent a lot of time looking out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft. The world seemed peaceful from 30,000 feet. Smaller somehow. Less complicated. Distance has a way of doing that. Problems that feel enormous on the ground often look different from above. Not insignificant. Just easier to understand. For years I had carried resentment toward my family. Not overwhelming resentment. Not hatred. Just a quiet ache. The ache of feeling unseen. The ache of watching someone else's pain matter more than your own. The ache of realizing that being the dependable child often means receiving less attention than the struggling one. Many people my age understand that feeling, especially those who grew up in families where one person's crisis became everybody else's priority. Looking down at those clouds, I finally understood something. My parents hadn't loved me less. They had simply worried about Jake more. Those aren't the same thing, and while that realization didn't erase the hurt, it helped me understand it. Understanding changes things. Over the next several months, something unusual happened. My family started paying attention. Not in a dramatic way. Not overnight. Slowly. Naturally. Mom called more often. Not to discuss Jake, to ask about me. The first time it happened, I almost laughed. She called one evening while I was making dinner. After a few minutes of conversation, she asked, "So what are you working on these days?" I actually paused because I couldn't remember the last time she'd asked. Not politely. Not out of obligation. With genuine interest. We spent nearly 40 minutes talking. About aviation. Travel. Career goals. Life. When we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. Smiling. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives through small questions that should have been asked years ago. Dad changed too. Though in his own way. One afternoon he mailed me a newspaper clipping. A local article about aviation. Nothing particularly special. Except for the handwritten note attached. Saw this and thought of you. Love, Dad. That was it. 12 words. Yet I probably read them 20 times. Because after years of feeling overlooked, even small signs of recognition carry enormous weight. So, the biggest change, however, came from Jake. Not immediately. Growth rarely happens immediately. But it happened. Gradually. Steadily. One choice at a time. For the first time in years, he stopped comparing our lives. Stopped measuring his losses against my successes. Stopped treating every accomplishment of mine as evidence of his failure. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was something better. It was real. One evening he called me unexpectedly. I signed up for flight lessons. I nearly dropped my phone. What? He laughed. You heard me. I sat down. Honestly stunned. At 37 years old, Jake wasn't trying to become a fighter pilot. That chapter was over. He knew it. I knew it. But for the first time in nearly 2 decades, he was reconnecting with the thing he loved instead of mourning the thing he lost. That mattered. A lot. How was it? I asked. There was a pause. Then I heard something I hadn't heard from him in years. Pure excitement. It was incredible. And just like that, I heard the boy from those childhood air shows again. The boy who stared at airplanes with wonder. The boy who dreamed without bitterness. The boy I'd missed. The following summer, another major air show came to Texas. This time my family attended in person. Not because I asked. Because they wanted to. Mom brought sunscreen. Dad brought binoculars. Jake showed up wearing an aviation cap that looked older than some of the spectators. The sight made me laugh. Before the event began, we stood together near the flight line. The sun was bright. The crowd was enormous. Children pointed toward aircraft. Veterans shared stories. Families spread blankets across the grass. America has a special relationship with air shows. They're part celebration, part history lesson, part family tradition. Standing there with my parents and my brother felt strangely emotional, not because I was flying, because for the first time in years we were sharing the experience together. No resentment, no competition, no old arguments, just family. Later that afternoon, after the demonstration ended, we sat together watching the crowd disperse. Jake nudged my shoulder, a familiar gesture from childhood. I was wrong about you. I smiled. You were wrong about a lot of things. He laughed. Fair enough. Then his expression softened. I'm proud of you, Em. The words were simple, ordinary. Yet somehow they meant more than any television broadcast ever could. Because this wasn't about being seen by millions of strangers. It was about being seen by the people who mattered. As I look back now, I realize something important. The greatest victory wasn't appearing on television. It wasn't earning wings. It wasn't proving anybody wrong. The greatest victory was learning that my worth never depended on their approval. Not my brother's, not my parents', not anyone's. Once I understood that, everything changed. Success became lighter. Relationships became healthier. Life became richer. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this story. Sometimes the people closest to us don't see us clearly. Sometimes they underestimate us. Sometimes they carry wounds that prevent them from recognizing our strengths. But we don't have to wait for recognition before moving forward. We don't have to wait for applause before becoming who we're meant to be. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, or perhaps a chapter of your own journey, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on it. And if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly working towards something meaningful, remember this. Keep going. The people around you may not see your progress right away, but that doesn't make it any less real. And if you enjoyed spending this time with me, I'd be honored if you'd share your thoughts, share this story with someone who might need it, and join me again for another journey.